Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
I have with me today Ambassador TCA Raghavan. He was India's High Commissioner to Pakistan and also Singapore. A veteran diplomat, he's now the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs, ICWA, on which he has now come out with a book on the institution itself. He has several books under him. And the book has been co-authored with Mr. Vivek Mishra. Welcome to the print, sir.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations on the book, sir. Let me just show it to my viewers. Sapru House, a story of institutional building in world affairs. This is a fantastic book, sir, and your co-author, he's a research fellow at the ICWA and a visiting faculty at the Rashtriya Raksha University in Gandhinagar. So, sir, let me just start asking you the first thing. I mean, it has been an iconic pre-independence era think tank when the concept of think tank was really not, was not there within public discourse. So, although you have dealt with it in a very deep manner in the book, but I would like to hear from you and our viewers. What really led to the fact that there should be a civil and a public discourse on India's foreign policy at a time in 1943? Then post-independence, it came to the Sapru House. So if you can, let our viewers also travel that interesting journey.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy, and so is my co-author, Dr. Vivek Mishra, that this book has come out. As you mentioned, it is a institutional history of the Indian Council of World Affairs, where I am currently, and so is Dr. Mishra. Both of us spend a lot of time there, which is why I was very keen soon after I joined the ICWA that it would be useful to delve into its history. And then I requested Dr. Mishra to work with me in bringing out this book. Now, the question you ask is an interesting one, but the simple answer is that the early 1940s was a period of great geopolitical churn. The most significant aspect of that was very clearly the realization in India that the country's colonial status was now a temporary affair. And at some stage, as soon as the Great War, as soon as the Second World War concluded, decolonization as a phenomena would set in. So that led to people thinking about independent India and its role in foreign affairs. But there was a wider geopolitical churn underway. And I think many of the founders of the Indian Council of World Affairs were sensitive to that churn, because it was an era which was seeing the rise of new powers. It was and the fact that these powers were in conflict with each other. A war which had begun in Europe and was an Atlantic war had spread to the Pacific and to Asia, and had become very much of an Asia-Pacific war, what we might today call an Indo-Pacific war. So Japan, India, China, the whole of Asia was in the midst of a deep-rooted churn, as indeed was Europe as a whole. And the fact was that the new power brokers which had emerged in the world order were now going to be the Soviet Union and the United States. So I think this wider churn made people think much more about the external world, and which is how a group of, as we have described in the book, a group of what were essentially public intellectuals, that is what we would call them today, people who were deeply engaged with different aspects of public life, decided to come together and found the council.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent, sir. And also, I mean, although that the first chapter, as you said, which is called the founding, is fascinating, but what also makes one understand and also question that at that point of time, as I said, this concept was not there, that there would be a a think tank kind of an institution where a lot of discourse will happen, open and free discussion, debate. So how difficult was it to even, raise the funds? I can see you've given a whole list of donors at that point of time who are very generous to go ahead and make contributions. So how challenging was it?
Well, the principal spirit behind the founding of the ICWA, one, of course, was Tej Bahadur Sapru, and he was a highly respected senior statesman in India at that time. But the moving spirit was Pandit Hridaynath Kunzru. And Kunzru was very much of an institution builder. Mm-hmm. He had been associated with an institution which was first set up in Pune by Gokhale. Thereafter was involved in a number of other institution building activities, and these institution building activities continued after independence also. So Kunzru was a great institution builder. I mean, he knew how to go about it. He knew, and he was very clear in his mind. He was, in that sense, a very strong liberal, that the institution had to be built with public contribution, and it had to be made up of like-minded people who were similarly associating themselves with it because they identified with its aims. And its principal aim, of course, was to discuss international affairs from an Indian perspective. So I think the fact that Pandit Hridaynath Kunzru was one of the moving spirits behind the setting of the council, and later on another great institution builder in his own way, Dr. Appadurai, came to be associated with the council as its Secretary General by 1947, 1948. I think these two individuals, apart from their many other achievements, they knew how to go about building up an institution brick by brick.
Mm-hmm. So also at that point of time, there was a lot of awareness on India's foreign policy, be it, on India-China. The first conference, as I understand, was on Asian relations. Today also, we see a lot of focus is given on how Asia itself creates, an ecosystem within itself. And also the Asia Pacific, which has today become the Indo-Pacific. So how would you see at that point of time the awareness that was there on some of the priorities that India had on geopolitics? Because that was also an era when we were going, becoming an independent country. So there were several other challenges. So how come foreign policy, how did it become a priority at that point of time?
Well, this is not so much in the book, because in the book we have tried to focus on the institution itself, largely looking at records of the older records of the ICWA itself. This is not so much in the book, but in fact, if one looks at it, there has been a much older tradition of discussing foreign policy in India than people normally assume. The general assumption is that foreign policy is very much of a state-driven enterprise. Before independence, it was the Department of the Political Affairs Department, which looked at all the neighboring areas, the tribal areas, and thereafter, from the 1940s, the Department of Commonwealth Affairs, which started looking at Indian immigrants in different countries. After 1947, the two came together. So it's largely seen as an exercise, as a state-driven exercise. In fact, it may not be so. Because if you see from the late 19th century, and especially in the Indian National Congress, there was always a great deal of discussion about many aspects which we today would call discussions of foreign and strategic policy. One very important element, for instance, in the discussions of the early Congress from 1985 onwards was the defense expenditure of the colonial government. That why is the Indian taxpayer paying for imperial adventures in China and Africa in elsewhere in Asia, in West Asia, and so on. So now this questioning of defense expenditure led to a questioning of defense and strategic policy. Secondly, there was always this great concern about Indian indentured labor in the Pacific Islands, in Southeast Asia, along the east coast of Africa. So what we think was a state-driven enterprise, when one looks at it closely, in fact was not so. So there was a tradition of civil society engaging with foreign policy issues, and I think that really came together after the ICWA was founded, because many people who had been associated with foreign policy but outside the state got a platform in which to articulate their views.
Mm-hmm. Sir, and also, I think in 1955, there was this foundation of the Indian School of International Studies that came in and was sort of subsumed with the ICWA. How was that as as one of the important landmarks, and how did that change the kind of discourse that took place, and how did it contribute to make ICWA what it is today?
Well, you see, the Secretary General of the ICWA, Dr. Appadurai, who I mentioned, he was by training a historian, and he then drifted towards political science, and finally, after joining ICWA, towards international relations. But he was very keen. He was very clear that for serious research had to be carried out, you also had to have teaching alongside it. You had to be building up the next generation of research workers and scholars. So from quite early on, from the early 50s, discussions began in the council, and we referred to some of those discussions. And these included some of the eminent educationists of the time, all of whom were associated with the council, V.K.R.V. Rao and others, about the fact that the council should also have a teaching arm. And it should have research students, and it should be bringing out people who do PhDs, and it should be a PhD PhD awarding institution. And this finally,
the library also sort of took off.
The setting up of the library, the fact that it had a journal. So while a conventional think tank thinks in terms of commenting or analyzing developments, the ICWA was different because it felt that apart from being a center for discussion and a center for analysis, it also had to be a pedagogic center, and it had to be teaching, and it had to be training the next generation of researchers. Mm-hmm. And that led to the founding of the Indian School of International Studies, which in the mid-70s moved to Jawaharlal Nehru University. And that story is outlined in the book. But the fact is that if you look at the landscape of international relations study in India today, it is populated to a very great extent by products of the Indian School of International Studies. Mm-hmm. Till about 30 or 40 years ago, and even now, many of the scholars who are involved in this field would be graduates, would be PhDs from the Indian School of International Studies when it was part of ICWA, but then subsequently from the School of International Studies of JNU. So it's had a very significant impact on the development of international relations study and the scholarship around international relations in India today.
Mm-hmm. Sir, and also at that point of time, I believe the focus was very much on East Asian affairs and also the neighborhood, Nepal, Vietnam, Central Asia, and these regions, Indonesia, Japan. Do you think that is what was needed then and even today, and maybe somewhere over this many years, the focus sort of shifted, and now we are back into it? What is your view on that, sir? Focus on the studies in Far East, East Asia, Central Asia.
Well, the council had a very strong emphasis, you're quite right, on Asian affairs, on its neighbors, but also on Africa. the 50s was the period of decolonization. So I think the colonial experience had a very profound impact on the nature of study and scholarship which was carried out in the Indian Council of World Affairs at that time. Now, for any country, I think your neighborhood, your immediate neighborhood and not so immediate neighborhood is always a vital priority in foreign policy. And that continues to a great extent. But since then, of course, the scope of foreign policy has widened a great deal. And the council itself has been taking up areas which were outside the original focus, outside its original focus. So there is, for instance, much more work now on Latin America, on the Caribbean, but also on there are, apart from this territorial interest, and the territorial interest, which was called area studies, has always been very strong in the ICWA. But apart from this area studies approach, the new areas which are very important also have some priority, which is climate change, more thematic areas, climate change, various multilateral economic issues, trade-related issues, and more recently, technology, artificial intelligence, and so on. So that original focus was there, and it remains to a very great extent, but the lens has widened a great deal.
So now if you can discuss a little bit on the chapter that you've written on turbulent waters from 65 to 1980, how was it for ICWA also? That was an era when it sort of developed and had a transformation as India was also changing, and the geopolitics politics was changing. So if you can throw some light on that as well, sir.
Well, you see, from the late 60s, the original founders, they were passing on. That generation was coming to an end. The question was, how would the council deal with this 1970s, 1980s? And I think this whole question of how does a think tank exist and how does it function became important. And it's really a larger issue of how institutions in India, especially institutions which focus on learning and on intellectual issues, how are they to manage? Now, the 70s was a period in which corporate funding as we know it today did not exist. So, and the council was very clear. The founders of the council had been very clear that they should not be dependent on government grants. That the council should raise its own funds, its own revenues. By then, the School of International Studies had shifted away, but the council's responsibilities remained the same. They had their journal to bring out. They had a huge library to maintain. They had the staff to pay. At the same time, research had to be carried out. Its normal activities had to continue. So how to raise funds? This was an issue to which they really had no answer. Because that earlier generation, which believed that what they were doing was important and it was not the salaries that they were getting, or for whom it was not a profession or a career, but a passion, that generation had passed on. The council had been set up as a society under the Societies Act, which meant that all its members could vote, and gradually a trend started of elections becoming more contested, people who were not really interested in the aims of the council becoming important figures in it, and a gradual decline set in. But the fundamental issue was the same, that how does a thought institution or an intellectual institution manage when it is not going to get government funds? And the reason why they were not keen on government funds was because they didn't want a bureaucratic institution. They wanted an institution which was independent. There was no real answer to that. And to a great extent, apart from the fact that you have corporate sponsorship today, there is no real answer to that. Which is why we've called this, Vivek Mishra and I have called this book a story of institution building, because there are a number of questions which are not answered. That how do thought institutions maintain themselves? In the council's case, in the case of the decline was so steep, and because it had such a high reputation, that decline was greeted with such public outrage that it led to a parliamentary intervention. And the feeling was that something had to be done.
Right.
And it led to parliamentary legislation declaring it to be an institution of national importance, with the Vice President of India as the head, to ensure its autonomy from the executive, and that it would thereafter receive funds from the Ministry of External Affairs. That was the compromise which was found in the case of the ICWA. But there is that larger question of how do intellectual institutions in India manage on a day-to-day basis? How do they raise their resources, except by relying either on the government for funds or on corporate sponsorship? And that question, as I said, is an open question even now.
Mm-hmm. I was coming to that, sir, also the fact that the challenge of that time, I believe the challenge is still there today, although today you have this plethora of think tanks coming in with research papers, and yes, of course, this has also expanded the landscape of research and opinion materials and other things. But I mean, in an environment like this, and also now in India, the think tank concept has also taken off. Do you think that makes it more difficult for an institution like ICWA to survive, or do you think that also helps because more the competition is, more the realization is that you need such institutions for generations to understand your history, your foreign policy, and many other aspects?
Well, the ICWA, I think, is fortunate because it deals with foreign policy. And because of that, it has an association with the Ministry of External Affairs. And the MEA, by its very nature, understands an animal such as the ICWA, because it is something which you encounter in different parts of the world. So the people who are in MEA recognize the importance of think tanks such as the ICWA, which have to be kept at arm's length, so that they don't get submerged by the much more powerful and larger personality of the MEA. So the ICWA is fortunate that it has people who understand the need for keeping an arm's length from it. But if you see in India, that general issue remains. You see, the declaring an institution to be an institution of national importance was something which was done with a significant number of bodies like the ICWA, which had been set up by high-minded individuals, and they functioned very well with the first and second generation who were deeply committed to the values and the aims of that institution. But thereafter, they went into periods of decline. And the challenge, therefore, is that if you leave these institutions as they are, then they become taken up by vested interests or they get deeply politicized. But if the government takes them over, as it has done for a number of them, then they get bureaucratized. And that original impulse which led to their founding gets diluted to a very great extent. So that question remains about institutions and about thought institutions or intellectual institutions in India. But I think the ICWA is a little more fortunate because, as I said, the Ministry of External Affairs, because of the people encountering, because of their exposure to similar institutions elsewhere, they recognize the nature of the beast, which a foreign policy think tank has to be.
Mm-hmm. Sir, and the line that struck me the most was, as you said in the epilogue, as a publicly funded think tank, ICWA's current and future role has to be grounded in new realities and not on the laurels of the past. what exactly do you mean by this, sir? And also, do you think that now, and this is your last month at the ICW as the Director General, do you think going forward for the future Director Generals of ICWA, will this be a challenge to keep this afloat? But as you said, since you have support from the MEA and they understand the importance of the institution, but do you think the laurels of the past is past, but now we need to move on with newer realities? And what are those?
Well, I think this moving on and facing up to current day challenges is something which is definitely there. But essentially, for a publicly funded institution like the ICWA, the issue is that you cannot just be another think tank, as there are a number of them in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Kolkata, in Chennai. You can't be a think tank in a metropolitan city. Your only difference being that you're not worried about funds. I think the challenge for the ICWA is to participate in the wider process of how do you make foreign policy more meaningful to the lay public, and secondly, how do you participate in democratizing that foreign policy by getting more people to participate in it. Now, this is something which is not new. The council itself, soon after it was set up, was convinced that it just couldn't function out of the national capital. And therefore, at one stage, they had as many as 35 or 40 what they call chapters, virtually one or two in every state, because they felt that you have to associate the rest of India with something which is otherwise seen as the exclusive domain of the national capital, which is the formulation of foreign policy and the study of international affairs. So I think for the ICWA, what has been done and what we have been trying to do is associate ourselves much more with activities, with study, with students, with teachers, with university departments, with think tanks in the rest of the country. There's a fair amount of that happening. We had our governing body meeting recently, and one of the points made was that the ICWA must carry out, must have partners in every state and union territory of India, so that it's doing something everywhere. And this is a point with which everyone agrees. So we do try to do that, but India is a big country. There's a great deal which remains to be done, and it is certainly one of the main issues, one of the main priorities of the council as it goes ahead, this democratization of foreign policy analysis and discussion. There are, of course, other things also to be done, which is, how do you ensure that your research and your products have rigor, improving the quality of your research material, improving the quality of your public engagement. So I think those are really the issues ahead. And it's quite true. You cannot just rest on the fact that you have had such a long and on the whole, a fine history, and you have a very good address and wonderful iconic building. You cannot just rest on that. But the challenge is to deepen your engagement and others' engagement with international affairs.
Mm-hmm. So, and my last question to you will be, and I think it'll be, it's an honor to hear it from you, being a veteran diplomat yourself, sir. How do you see India's foreign policy has changed what it was when ICW was it was in its inception in 1943, and in 2021? How do you think it changed? In the sense, what are the priorities, or do you think it's really the same, just that we need to face the challenges in a different manner?
Well, in a sense,
in one of our important neighborhood in Pakistan, so you would know more deeply on this.
Well, in a sense, everything has changed, but in many ways, nothing has changed because fundamentally, your approach, I think, remains guided by the fact that you are a developing country and your principal challenges are domestic and not external. The role of foreign policy has to be to see as to how you can secure a external environment which allows you to address your domestic challenges, which are of unemployment, which are of poverty, which are of lack of education, public health, and all of those, the challenges which a developing country faces. Your foreign policy has to be geared towards securing an external environment by which you can address these domestic issues in the best way possible. So that has not changed because that was the thinking in the 40s and 50s, and that certainly, I think, is also to a great extent the thinking now. But the world has changed. You have new powers who have come up. You have other older powers who have declined. Your neighborhood has changed. In the 40s, in 1943, when the council was founded, your external neighborhood was entirely different because you were directly connected to Central Asia and Afghanistan. That direct connect no longer exists. In the 40s, Tibet was there as some kind of undefined space between you and China. That space no longer exists. So to a very great extent, your external environment has changed. In the 1940s, you were faced with, the world was faced with a pacific power which had emerged in the last 20-25 years in the form of Japan. Today, you are engaged with a new pacific power in the form of China, which has emerged, and it is just like the Japanese moved towards Asia and towards the Indian Ocean. The Chinese are doing the same. That changes your entire approach to the neighborhood, to your neighborhood. So these are new issues, and as I said, in some ways the whole world has changed since then. But the ICWA is not a policy formulation institution; it's a research institution, and fundamentally, its aim is to have a mindset towards of research and analysis, which is sophisticated, which is open to fresh ideas, which is open to nuances, and how do you sharpen your research methodologies? How do you make your research products match with the best in the world? I think those were the aims in the 1940s, and those remain the aims even now. And in that sense, therefore, there is a fundamental continuity.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. That's a fascinating conversation with you and a fascinating book. I would urge my viewers to please go ahead and pick up the book on Sapru House that Delhiites will definitely know about, but even outside Delhi for sure. But thank you for your time, sir, and please take care and congratulations again. Unfortunately, we could not have Dr. Mishra, but thank you for this giving time to The Print. Please take care.
Thank you. Thank you.